Hi folks, my name is Nandita Bajaj and I'm the Executive Director of Population Balance. I'm also an adjunct faculty member at the Institute for Humane Education with Antioch University. I recently completed my graduate degree in humane education. Broadly speaking, humane education has three major pillars. It seeks to foster respect, empathy, and compassion for the living world. It builds critical thinking skills. And with all of that knowledge and skills, it encourages and promotes taking meaningful action. My discussion topic today is looking at the issue of our population pressures on the living world, specifically on animals, from a humane education framework. In that respect, human overpopulation is an issue that intersects with human rights, animal protection, and environmental restoration. And as such, it is a significant and all-encompassing topic. I'll go over four major things today. How do human population pressures impact animals? Why is overpopulation such a controversial topic? We'll look at pronatalism, the social pressures towards having children, and its link to overpopulation. And we'll end off with some solutions from a humane education framework. This is a graph depicting the size of the world population over the last 12,000 years. It took us 10,000 years to reach the first billion, which is around 1800. And then, due to a number of advances in medicine, technology, and fossil fuel discovery, our death rate went down significantly and our population started to grow exponentially. As a result, in about 200 years, our population has grown from 1 billion to almost 8 billion now, where we have slowly dominated much of the natural world. The rate at which we are growing, we are adding 80 million additional people each year to the planet, which is equivalent to the size of Germany, and that amounts to about 1 million people every 5 days. In terms of the impact that our growing numbers have had on the planet and all the living beings, we see here a graph depicting the correlation between the growth in our numbers, highlighted in purple, overlaid with the massive rate of extinction of plant and animal species in green. Here what you see is a distribution of all life on Earth by biomass. So we're at 82% plants, 13% bacteria, 5% everything else, which includes animals and humans. So humans only represent 0.01% of all life on Earth, but we have destroyed 83% of wild animals. This is what that looks like. Human expansionism through hunting, poaching, and animal agriculture is wiping out the last of what remains of wildlife on Earth. Humans and the land animals that are killed for food represent 96% of all the mammals. Only 4% of what's left are wild animals. The data looks very similar for birds, where 70% of the birds are used for food, whereas 30% of the remaining birds are wild. The future projections look worse. Here we see a breakdown of the rise in global meat production over the last 50 years. We were at about 4 billion in 1970 and have doubled to about 8 billion now. During that time, the global demand for animal products has more than tripled. You'll see in Asia, where the middle class has been rapidly expanding, that demand has actually increased tenfold. These trends will continue as more societies increase both in their standard of living and also their population sizes. Currently, we kill 70 billion animals each year for food, and only in 30 more years, that number is expected to double to 140 billion. Similarly, global production of fish and seafood has quadrupled over the past 50 years. That means that there's twice as many of us, and we're each consuming twice as much seafood than we did 50 years ago. So there's irrefutable evidence that our growth in numbers, as well as our consumption, is responsible for wiping out 85% of wildlife and the thousands of billions of animals that were killed for food in just the last few hundred years. Yet, human overpopulation is a controversial topic, and most social justice movements will not touch it. In fact, many go so far as to say that it is a myth. Here you see some headlines, the first one being George Monbiot, the Guardian columnist who is a friend of the animals and the environment, who publicly denounces overpopulation and has even alluded to population activists such as Jane Goodall and David Attenborough being racist. Sierra Club has taken a similar position after advocating for a sustainable population for decades. They share a similar view, while many others are creating a different kind of alarmism, that we are in a state of decline. Naturally, there's a lot of confusion around the subject, and that's because it's a very complex topic. The reason it is rightfully such a sensitive subject is because there have been and continue to be several examples of coercive and exploitative population policies. For example, only a few years before I was born in India, there was a mass sterilization program put into place in an effort to control the population growth. Several million men and women, primarily from impoverished communities, were coerced into giving up their reproductive freedoms. There are other similar examples in the past and present that have violated and continue to violate these most basic rights. So we do have to acknowledge and denounce and work to eradicate any such population control methods. But what we don't often think of in terms of population control is coerced reproduction, when women around the world, but especially in the most impoverished and marginalized communities, are forced into procreating, often due to patriarchal and religious forces. There are overt and subtle methods that different communities employ to make sure that women have children, and many of them. In fact, according to WHO, there are 270 million women around the world who wish to avoid a pregnancy but do not have the means or information to do so. 80 million children are born each year who are unwanted, putting both the mother's and their offspring's life in danger. Coerced reproduction is actually far more prevalent than coerced prevention, and is just as egregious a violation of reproductive rights. But most of us don't think of it that way because we see having children as natural and normal. And this is where we get into pronatalism, which is a set of social, cultural, patriarchal, religious, political, and economic pressures placed on people to have children. I have two definitions here of pronatalism. One is an attitude or policy that is pro-birth, that encourages reproduction, that exalts the role of parenthood. The second one is the idea that parenthood and raising children should be the central focus of every person's adult life. It is a strong social force and includes a collection of beliefs so embedded that they have become to be seen as true. As I had mentioned earlier, these pressures are a source of much confusion, suffering, as well as reproductive and social injustice around the world for adults and children alike. Pronatalism also happens to be at the heart of our unchecked population growth. Pronatalism shows up through several different power structures. We have religious institutions that are pressuring people to have children to gain more followers, big businesses to gain more consumers, politics to gain more taxpayers, and then there are cultural pressures ranging from family pressure, pressure to maintain a tradition, to maintain a genealogical legacy, and a range of unexamined assumptions that we'll get into shortly. Religious pressures show up in the form of shame, guilt, and fatalism. You see them in the form of active restriction of contraceptives through, for example, the Catholic Church, or a ban on family planning services and vasectomies, such as what is happening in Iran right now. Or even eugenic-driven agenda against anti-minorities, such as outnumbering a certain tribe or religion, like what is currently happening in India. The Economy-driven pressures are something that you will all probably be familiar with most, given the recent alarmism in the news about the baby bust. Overt, demeaning statements like, "We need more babies," or "Can we pay women to have more babies?" are all over the news. The US and much of the capitalist world believes that new bodies are needed constantly to produce more consumers, more laborers. This pronatal, pro-capital belief is grossly dehumanizing in that it commodifies people. It sees them as pawns to keep the economic engine going. Political pressures can be overt or subtle. Overt pressures look much like the economy-driven pressures, with alarmism around not having enough taxpayers, such as these headlines, "Women are deciding not to have babies, and that's bad for all of us." These narratives are based on false assumptions, the most common one being that we need to keep adding a younger workforce in order to pay for the elderly costs. This often looks like lump sum baby bonuses for every child that you have, a purely transactional relationship with people with no consideration about the well-being of individuals or families. Subtle pressures can be harder to identify because they are often camouflaged as family-friendly and even feminist-friendly, with perks and tax credits for each child that you have. These can obviously be really helpful for many of the families, especially those who can use the financial support to give their children a fair start in life. However, it is still important to note that the policies exist with one main goal in mind, and that is to promote reproduction, without much emphasis on neutralizing the social equities that exist in society. And finally, cultural pressures are the hardest to detect because they literally are the water that we're swimming in. These could be pressures from family. You see it in the media with glorification of pregnancy and parenthood. You see pressures to carry on one's tradition or genealogical legacy. Or there could be psychological assumptions such as, we have a biological instinct to have children. You hear words being thrown around like the biological clock or the maternal instinct, or that male virility is related to fatherhood. Other ideas like there's something wrong with you if you don't want children, like the headline suggests, women who don't have children go crazy. Ideas such as having kids is the most fulfilling path in life, and sometimes you see impersonal assumptions like, I need to have a child to save my marriage or to take care of me when I'm older. The problem is that such pressures can be really harmful for several reasons. They prevent an authentic discussion around family choices, where the true impact of having children on personal relationships, on society, on the environment, and even on the children are not discussed openly. The voices of parents who are struggling or regret this decision are not included in the discourse. The risks of bringing children into a world facing enormous global issues are also often left off the table. So these pressures really get in the way of deeply examining these most important decisions and being able to make liberated, informed, and responsible choices. So where do we go from here, knowing that our growing population is putting immense pressure on the planet and all of the beings on the planet, but also that our population growth is actually premised on the exploitation of people, of animals, and all of nature through these harmful pronatalist and anthropocentric forces? Here's a graph from the UN depicting possible projections of where we're headed. In the next 30 years, we are expected to add another 2 billion people if we stay on the current trajectory. By the year 2100, the world population could actually vary by billions of people, depending on whether the average woman in the world today has one more child or one fewer child in her lifetime. This could be a difference between 16 billion people versus 7.5 billion by the end of the century. In terms of quantifying the impact of having children, specifically as it relates to the climate crisis, which is the most imminent threat to all of life on Earth now, Here's a graphic from a recent study conducted at Lund University that looked at 39 different studies. This graphic shows that of all the different eco-friendly actions one can take, having one fewer child is by far the most impactful. Note that this data actually applies specifically to industrialized countries like the US and Canada. So this information actually neutralizes any dichotomy about the narrative that population growth is only happening in certain countries and that our fertility rate is already low, so we don't have to worry about, population growth. And this is where the population and consumption connection really comes in. And so if one looks more holistically at animal protection, our reproductive decisions can play a huge role. Having one fewer child is 73 times more effective for the planet and for the animals than being vegan alone. To end off, I just wanted to share what we are doing at Population Balance. I joined the organization about 5 months ago after working in engineering and education for the last 15 years. I came into the population movement from a humane education framework. I see overpopulation not just as a cause of immense suffering for marginalized human and ecological communities, but also I see population growth itself premised on a misuse of power. As we saw, population growth relies on harmful pronatalism and anthropocentrism that seeks to help a small minority of people who are in power at the expense of everyone else. As such, it is a major human, animal, and environmental rights issue. At Population Balance, we are working to challenge pronatalism to allow liberated and responsible procreative choices. We also advocate for an ecocentric relationship to the planet that is based in reverence and stewardship. And lastly, we challenge unjust, growth-driven systems that perpetuate inequities. We do this work through collaboration with other social and animal justice organizations, such as through this conference, as well as by offering educational platforms such as our podcast, webinars, and classroom visits. You can find us at populationbalance.org, and that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.